If you grew up in the 1990s, you experienced something unprecedented in human history. You're the last generation to have a fully analog childhood, and the first to become digital natives as teenagers. And psychologists are discovering that this unique timing created a generation with remarkable adaptability, technological fluency with human connection skills, and a psychological profile that bridges the pre-internet and post-internet worlds in ways that make you uniquely valuable in the modern era. If you grew up in the 1990s, you experienced something unprecedented in human history. You're the last generation to have a fully analog childhood, and the first to become digital natives as teenagers. And the psychologists are discovering that this unique timing created a generation with remarkable adaptability, technological fluency with human connection skills, and a psychological profile that bridges the pre-internet and post-internet worlds in ways that make you uniquely valuable. In the modern era, let's talk about what makes you different from every generation around you. If you grew up in the 1990s, roughly born between 1985 and 1995, you experienced the most dramatic technological and cultural shift in human history during your most formative years. You spent your childhood completely analog, playing outside, using landline phones, watching scheduled television, and socializing face-to-face. Then, right as you hit adolescence, the digital revolution exploded. The internet went mainstream. Cell phones became ubiquitous. Social media emerged, and the entire world transformed. Research from developmental psychology reveals that experiencing this transition during your formative years created a unique psychological profile, characterized by digital fluency combined with analog social skills, adaptability to massive change, and the ability to function authentically in both digital and physical worlds, making you what psychologists call digitally bicultural. Here's what makes 90s kids psychologically unique. You had the last pure, analog childhood. Grew up without internet, without cell phones, without social media, without constant connectivity. Your childhood looks almost unrecognizable to kids growing up today. You called friends' houses and talked to their parents. You made plans and kept them because you couldn't text to cancel. You were bored regularly and had to entertain yourself. You developed social skills through face-to-face interaction because there was no other option. Research shows that this analog foundation built communication skills, patience, creativity, and social competence that digital-first generations struggle to develop. You have skills that are becoming rare and increasingly valuable, but then, this is crucial, you adopted digital technology during your adolescence and young adulthood. The internet became accessible right when you were old enough to use it independently. You got your first cell phone in high school or college. You joined social media platforms as they launched. You learned to navigate digital spaces during your brain's peak plasticity period. Studies show that technology adopted during adolescence becomes native-level fluency. You're not digital immigrants struggling with technology like older generations, and you're not digital natives who can't function without it like younger generations. You're digitally bicultural, liquidly fluent in both analog and digital worlds. Let's talk about the specific cultural elements that shaped your psychology. The 1990s were characterized by unprecedented optimism and prosperity. The Cold War had ended, the economy was booming, technology promised a utopian future. Y2K was the biggest worry, and it turned out to be nothing. You grew up in what researchers call the long peace, a period of relative global stability and economic growth. This created baseline optimism and hope that persists even after you've experienced subsequent challenges. Unlike generations shaped by war, depression, or crisis, you developed with expectations of progress and possibility. Here's the media landscape piece. You're the last generation to experience monoculture, when everyone watched the same shows, listened to the same music, and shared the same cultural references. There were only a few TV channels. MTV actually played music videos. Radio was how you discovered new music. Movies were cultural events you saw in theaters, not streams you consumed alone. Research shows this shared cultural experience created stronger generational bonds and cultural literacy than the algorithmic fragmentation that followed. You can reference a 90s show, a song to another 90s kid and instantly connect through shared memory. This cultural cohesion is something younger generations don't have. Research on childhood freedom reveals that 90s kids had the tail end of unsupervised play. You were probably allowed to roam the neighborhood, ride bikes to friends' houses, play in woods or parks without adult supervision, but you were also the generation where helicopter parenting started creeping in. Studies show this balance created independence with some safety awareness. You learned self-reliance but also caution. You're not as fearless as older generations who had complete freedom, but you're more independent than younger generations raised under constant supervision. Let's talk about the technology adoption curve. You witnessed the birth of the internet and participated in its evolution. You remember dial-up modems, AOL chat rooms, early websites, the excitement of getting email. You adopted each new technology as it emerged: texting, social media, smartphones, apps. Research on technology adoption shows that people who have gradually integrated technology tend to have healthier relationships with it than those born into it. You use technology as a tool, not as an extension of self. You can disconnect because you remember life before constant connectivity. Here's the social skills foundation that differentiates you. You've learned to socialize face-to-face before social media existed. You asked people out in person. You navigated conflicts directly. You read body language and facial expressions without screen mediation. You developed empathy through real human interaction. Then you added digital communication skills on top of this foundation. Research shows that people who develop social skills offline first have better overall social competence than those who develop primarily through screens. You can do both, connect deeply in person and communicate effectively online. Studies on adaptability reveal that 90s kids score exceptionally high. Why? Because you experienced massive technological and cultural change during your formative years. Your baseline assumption is that the world will transform dramatically and you'll need to adapt. Older generations resist change because their formative years were more stable. Younger generations expect certain technologies to always exist. You expect constant evolution and adapt accordingly. Research shows this makes you particularly successful in rapidly changing work environments and industries. Let's address the 90s nostalgia phenomenon. You feel strong nostalgia for 90s culture, the music, shows, fashion, toys. But research on nostalgia reveals something important. You're not nostalgic for the 90s because they were perfect. You're nostalgic for a time before constant connectivity, before social media comparison, before information overload, before digital surveillance. You remember simplicity, privacy, and being fully present in moments without documenting them. This isn't naive romanticization, it's legitimate recognition that something valuable was lost in the digital transition. Here's the work ethic component. You came of age during the late 90s .com boom, then watched it bust in the early 2000s. You saw economic prosperity followed by recession, then recovery, then the 2008 financial crisis. You've navigated multiple boom-bust cycles in your career. Research shows this creates realistic expectations about job security and career paths. You're not entitled like stereotypes of millennials suggest. And you're not cynical like Gen X, you're pragmatically resilient. You work hard but protect yourself because you've seen that loyalty isn't rewarded. Research on identity formation reveals that 90s kids benefited from developing identity offline. Your most awkward phases weren't documented and posted online. You could experiment with different styles, interests, and friend groups without permanent digital record. You made mistakes that stayed private. Studies show that identity formation benefits from privacy and ability to reinvent yourself. Social media makes this nearly impossible for younger generations. Your identity is solid because it was built without constant external validation or documentation. Let's talk about the communication evolution you experienced. You wrote notes to pass in class. You called friends on corded phones in your kitchen where family could hear. You learned written communication through email and instant messaging. You adopted texting, then social media, then video calls. Research shows that people who learned multiple communication modalities tend to be better communicators overall. You can adapt your communication style to medium and audience. You're not bound to one way of connecting. Here's the cultural critique awareness. You grew up watching shows that were edgy and boundary-pushing for the time but would be considered problematic now. You've watched culture shift on issues like gender, sexuality, race, and more. You've had to examine and sometimes reject beliefs you absorbed as kids. Research shows this kind of cultural evolution during your lifetime creates both openness to change and appreciation for complexity. You're not rigidly attached to how things were, but you also understand that cultural progress isn't always linear. Studies on